Welcome to my Shakuhachi channel. I am very honored that Professor Max Deeg, is that right pronounced, your name?
Yeah.
Yeah. Professor in Buddhist Studies at the School of History, Archaeology and Religion at Cardiff University has joined me. And we are going to talk about an article that Professor Max Deeg published quite a long time ago in 2007, Komusō and Shakuhachi-Zen, from Historical Legitimation to Spiritualisation of a Buddhist denomination in the Edo Period. And I'm really happy that you will join us because I think this will interest a lot of people. Max, could you just, in the beginning, tell us about your academic background? Yeah, like what did you study and what did you specialize in? And
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is quite complex because I grew up in Germany when universities were not bound by curricula. So students, particularly humanities students who were curious, could explore whatever they wanted. So this is also where my kind of journey to the East started. So I started as a quite normal student, trying to become a teacher for French and German. German I know, French I didn't know that well, but for a teacher it obviously was good enough. But then was drawn into all kind of language studies, philology. So I became, together with a couple of other peers, a collector of strange ancient languages, which was not really helping very much for the career as a French and German teacher, but was much more interesting than what a teacher would have had to do. So one language was added to the other. At one point, I actually then started a formal training of Japanese and Sanskrit. So my let's say Oriental background is classical Indology, Sanskrit, with a strong interest in the very old period of India, so the Vedic period, but also at that time already in Buddhism. So, I mean, to understand how it works in the German, at that time at least, in the German classical Indology, in a classical Indology department, you would normally do a Sanskrit class, and you would also do a so-called Middle Indic language, which very often was Pali, which is the language of the so-called Theravada or Southern Buddhists. So Buddhism was was linked to that language, and the other stuff was linked to Sanskrit. In Germany at that time, you needed two minors going with a major. The major was classical Indology, and the minor was actually then what we called Japanology, so Japanese studies. And I think at that time it was linguistics still. So Japanese was then on board. So people were asking, what strange mixture is this? You have Japanese on the one side and you have Sanskrit, Indian on the other side. So how does that go together? That huge chunk in the middle, China, actually is missing. So the reason that I went for Japanese instead of Chinese was that I thought Japanese would be easier than Chinese, which I now know is not the case. Well, I think naivety sometimes is a good thing because you're doing things that you would normally not do. So the Japanese was there, an interest in Buddhism was there, which did not really flower at that time so much. But at the same time, I also was, besides actually being a motorbike rider of a Japanese motorbike of a Yamaha, I was also very interested in, just to show you how kind of crazy this kind of exploration of all kind of things was. We had a Zendo at my university town, so there was a possibility, and actually because I was also doing martial arts, one added to the next, and so some of us from the martial arts club would also go to do zazen. So there was a kind of, how to say, kind of a mixture there, which did not really go into that direction, because at the same time I swore to myself I would never publish something on a subject that I was doing myself. So no Zen, no academic writing on Zen, no academic writing on martial arts. Just do it and keep it apart from the rest. After the PhD, which was, as I said, classical Indology, I took up a post at Nagoya University in Japan, and was there as a teacher of German language and culture for 5 years, teaching there, also doing a little bit of Indology. And at that time, I decided I needed a kind of new hobby. So then the idea came up, well, why not actually do something with music, a traditional instrument? And I remember that we actually went to a ski resort with students for a German, a week of teaching German. And there was actually a Japanese German teacher who had left university and had gone to, where was it actually? I think it was in Takayama. So we were there, and this guy was a very passionate shakuhachi player, and also a very passionate sake drinker. So one evening we ended up with him in his house drinking, and him showing us his self-made shakuhachi. So he also actually made his own shakuhachi, which is quite something, as most of the listeners probably will know. And so the old myth came up, the myth which I actually have packed into the last footnote of the article. I just reread it. I had to reread it because I forgot everything that was in it before this. Where the myth came up, well, shakuhachi is so difficult to learn, and foreigners particularly probably will take them for years just to get a sound out of the bamboo.
Yeah.
Well, I think we were probably drunk and loose enough. So I was given the shakuhachi, and I have to say I have a little of a background of classical flute. So at least I knew how to use the mouthpiece and fiddle around a little bit, and there it was. There was a sound. So our host was quite impressed. Said, "Oh, you have to learn that. You have to learn that." So yeah. So it was settled. So I went back, and then I looked for a teacher, which was a little bit difficult because I didn't know anybody who actually was playing. Finally, I found a teacher, a very old Japanese man who unfortunately died 4 months after I started learning. So I was lost again, and then actually my wife said, well, in this evening culture center we have in our supermarket around the corner, they actually offer shakuhachi lessons. So I went there, and luckily enough, actually, I met a teacher who was, I don't know if he's known outside of Japan, Kato Jozan. You already can see that it was Tozan Ryu.
Yeah.
I was practicing. So a very impressive player, who's now, I just Googled him, who's now actually lecturing at Nagoya Musical University. So we actually made it into...
I know him. Oh, Kato-san. Yeah. I know
yeah. So he's, I mean, he was very impressive, and he also was very liberal. So it just allowed me to do what I wanted. So I didn't have to go through all the different pieces which the others had to do, the oji-sans that were practicing with me. So I said, well, I want to do Honkyoku, and just brought me to the level to at least try Honkyoku at a very early stage. Probably a little bit too early, but anyway. So that was my kind of background with shakuhachi.
Yeah, so I had a question. Do you actually play? Because you do mention this story with the 2 years.
I played. I don't play a lot these days, but I played. When we were in Japan, I had these regular lessons and actually was practicing quite a lot. I wasn't very good, I would say, but still.
Yeah, no, that's great. Okay, so coming back to the article, so would you say that your main sources were, of course, Kyotaku Denki Kokujikai, which I have here, and then also Ue no Katami.
Yeah. Actually, that book was the trigger. So it kind of, as I said, there was a fermentation process already in place, despite the fact that I had decided at a very early stage in my academic career not to write on anything that I was doing myself. I was practicing. I broke that vow. Ueno's book was one thing. I picked that up at some point when I was on a research fellowship in Japan. I think I bought it in Tokyo, just out of curiosity, out of interest, and then actually at that time I was doing some research on sites Orientalism. I don't know if that, I think it's mentioned in the article. It's this theory by the kind of very popular theory at one time in academia, that actually the West's engagement with the East is triggered by colonialism. So how the West actually deals with the East, also in terms of research, not only in terms of academic dealing, not only in terms of administration and colonialists, so to speak. The dealing with Asian cultures also is a kind of colonializing experiment, and we still have that heritage when we are doing so-called Orientalist studies. So Orientalist in science understanding actually is someone, mostly in the 19th century, but still people in the 20th century as well, who looks at Asian culture through a very specific toggle. Through a very has a very specific angle on that topic, dominates it, actually interprets it as he or she likes it, and it fits to certain power aspects. So you're in control of the subject, and you're doing with it what it necessarily isn't in its original context. So the side actually criticized that approach and said, well, we have to do better. We have to do a post-colonial approach to it. So we, together with a couple of colleagues, and we were all doing a history of Asian religions, so we actually dealt with that topic for quite a while. And so when I read Ueno, I said, well, this is a topic, this is something I could use to test Said's theory, so the Orientalist approach, in a not purely academic way, but also, there are also popular Orientalists who actually look at Asian cultures in a very, let's call it romanticized way, to be a little bit more simplistic, and kind of disentangle this kind of story. How actually does something that comes from Asia become popularly Orientalistically reframed? Okay. That actually brought me back to that to Ueno's book and the material that was in there. I mean, I had not much clue about what the historical sources were at that time, but Ueno, of course, gave quite a lot of hints. So I got the material together. Some of it was sent to me by Japanese colleagues from Japan, because there was no access to to the material in Western Western libraries. Some of the colleagues actually who were Buddhist, I said, "What? Why do you want that stuff? That's not what you're normally doing." I said, "Well, I'm just I want to write something about this, so can you please send me the stuff?" So they sent me, very gratefully, they sent me photocopies of most of the material I was using.
Okay.
So at a point I was equipped with the material I wanted, and I just had to apply the ideas I had developed in the context of doing some research on Orientalism in the side sense, and applied to the deconstruction of the Fuke and the Komusō myth.
So
Um,
how does the Orientalism come in? I mean, because most of your article, after all, is kind of looking at the history, but is it? I mean, if you bring it up to today, or how we look at Japan and Japanese religion and Zen Buddhism especially.
Yeah, I mean, I start the article, if you remember, by referring to the ubiquitous and notorious Tetaro Suzuki, who, of course, I mean, that's the classic example how Zen actually got projected to the West and actually was taken up, and then all kind of things were done with it. So romanticization, so a lot of citations where you stumbled across when you started are in play here. Yeah, and then I mean, decoding and deconstructing Suzuki and his Zen has been done for a while by colleagues. So Bernard Faure is a very good example for doing this. Who else? Yeah, there are some out there who are still doing it. And this, I mean, because Fuke was related then, according to the traditional reading, to the Rinzai-shu, of course there was a Zen connection. I said, well, why not doing the same as my colleagues are doing, much better in their fields, with that little piece I have in front of me. And well, then it started from there. And of course, then knowing a little bit more about, for instance, Buddhism in general, as it was transmitted from India to China, and also about Chinese Buddhism, which is one of my specialties. Reading the Kyotaku Denki, then, of course, immediately certain things just jumped into your eyes. So the whole construction of the lineage, the linking it to a Japanese famous monk who went to Sung, China, to study there, who is a historical figure after all, and then this linking it together, and then actually projecting it even further back into the Tang period, where of course Fuke comes in, Fuke Zenshi comes in, who is there in the records, in the Zen records, seemed a quite interesting example of a constructed legitimizing history.
Yes, and you write very well about that, the whole process. So I would like definitely to go more into that. I was just wondering if it wouldn't be good if you told us right now, like, about if you summarized your conclusion in some ways, told us what did you get to, and then we can go back and find out how you did.
Yeah, okay. So the writing process, I mean, you now know in what kind of setting this kind of originated from. So it was this Orientalism thing which I was dealing with at that time. It was Ueno's book, and then I was, and I'm still very interested in narratives. So I'm one of my specialties, probably, if there is a specialty, is to actually read, deconstruct and recontextualize narratives, particularly narratives of legitimation. So something that is around everywhere. I mean, if you have a new Buddhist school or whatever, they come up with a story why they are so important and why they have the link back to the founder, which in our case, of course, then would be the Buddha. So this experience then actually, as I said, immediately drew me to the Kyotaku Denki, where then, of course, you could also very easily show that they were using certain elements from the Sung and the Tang period Zen records and amalgamated them into something new, which is very interesting, because of course all the Honkyoku bear names that have a link with the Kyotaku.
Yes.
And that, of course, goes back to an earlier strand of literature, which whoever created the Kyotaku Denki were aware of. They knew exactly what they were doing. So then the next step then would zooming out of the text and saying, well, now, if this is the case, if this is a construct, and I'm not actually using this in a pejorative way, to be sure. Everything is constructed. I mean, whatever we read in terms of historical sources is, to a certain extent, it's never a one-to-one replica representation of history as it was, if there was something like that. So what interests me more in these narratives is why and how they are constructed. They are constructed in this way for a certain purpose. And in the case of the Kyotaku Denki, of course, it was constructed to legitimize an emerging, I would say, group that more and more got institutionalized in a specific political context, which is late Tokugawa Japan. And with a little bit of knowledge about all of these things, actually, you can then look at the context where this all might have happened. I mean, I say might have happened because we can't be sure, because the sources are too scarce.
No, of course not.
But what is clear is, and also, of course, my knowledge of classical Chinese, Tang, more than Sung Chinese, but I mean, there's not much difference, also clearly showed me that the Kyotaku Denki is a nicely done text, but it's not an old ancient Chinese text as it claims to be.
No, I mean, so, you know, for Kyotaku Denki, Kokujikai is the one that we have, so it's the translation into Japanese, but supposedly there should have been a Chinese version that...
Well, no, actually there is, I may be wrong and you may be right, so you see how much I have forgotten already, but there was a, wasn't there a purely kanbun version of it, which no Japanese okurigana?
I have only seen the Japanese version.
I would have to go back to my sources, but at the moment I can't, because they're all in the office in Cardiff and I'm in Germany in lockdown. So anyway, I mean, even if it's a furiganized Japanese version with the katakana syntagmas stuck to it, of course, it still wants to be a Chinese text, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, and then if you read it from that angle, you can, at some places, you clearly see, well, this is not a Chinese of the Sung, neither of the Sung nor of the Tang, probably of the Sung dynasty, who has written whatever was the original.
Is that the language, the way of writing it?
Yeah, it's the way actually they if you take off the furigana and just have it as a Chinese text, there are some strange features which make much more sense in a Japanese kanbun reading than in a purely Chinese one.
In a Chinese context, yeah. So also what I found quite interesting was that you write that Fuke is actually not an important figure in Tang Dynasty, you know, Zen Buddhist history. While
yes, I mean, he never really reached the status of a patriarch. He was the crazy madman, which attracted later attention when Zen actually, at least some strands inside of Zen, became a little bit more obsessed with this crazy aspect of the tradition, rather than with the more institutionalized, straightforward, monastic way of doing things. So when that happened, of course, and there was in the Sung period, you can already see actually a certain interest in the guy, but it really took off in Japan, where they came at a later stage, that was rather than Tokugawa period Zen, where they became fascinated with crazy Fuke. And that, of course, also brings us exactly into the into the area where the Kyotaku came into existence. So they picked up a figure who was not very well known. It was known, but it was not a big shot in traditional Zen. And well, this was, of course, a tradition you could pick up, because this was exactly because he was not the big patriarch. Okay. You could actually play with him. Would he have been a recognized patriarch, and you would have come up with a story about him, people would have said, no, I mean, we have so many sources about this guy, you can't say that he was this and that. But because we only have these few anecdotes about him, which are, of course, very kind of mystical, very strange, he was the right patriarch for that lineage.
Okay, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So it's quite well thought of in some ways.
Oh yeah, I mean, these legitimation stories, if they want to take off, they have to be well done.
Yes, I suppose that you're right. So you also write that it's striking that there's no real detailed study of the Fuke in Japanese Buddhist studies literature. So, I mean, so even in Japan, there haven't been much interest about Fuke Sect. And also, I can say as an ethnomusicologist that there's very little research done by scholars in Japan on shakuhachi. So it's kind of interesting. There's all this polemic around it, but like solid research seems to be very little of it.
I think it first has to do with how academic Buddhist studies in Japan work. You kind of do, and that's in humanities in general, you actually try to find a niche for yourself, for your research, which is mainstream enough to be successful as an academic. You can't sell a product that is not very well known, but at the same time is not too much overlapping with anybody else's. Now, the last bit, of course, could mean that some Japanese scholars would have jumped on that topic, but they didn't. And the reason for it, I think, is that Fukishu was always there was always the kind of understanding that this was something heterodox. It was not completely orthodox and in the mainstream. So the Myoanji, okay, it's a side temple of something, but it's not really right. Okay. And then the fact that very soon, of course, they lost momentum in a way in terms of source production, because the laity actually took over the representation of shakuhachi playing in mainstream society.
Yes.
Of course, there is not much you can do with it.
Yeah, and yes, and the thing with the lack of sources is a big thing, isn't it? I spoke with a Zen Buddhist scholar here at Aarhus University here in Denmark, and his name is Jørgen Borup, and he said that he was also attracted to Fuke Sect, and he considered the subject for his PhD, but realized that with the sources, he couldn't do much with it, so he went somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, you can do with it, I would say, maybe a little bit more than I've done with the stuff, by digging a little bit deeper, but I guess there is not much more you can squeeze out of it. So if you want to concentrate on Fuke, because think about it, it's very short-lived. I mean, the institutionalization happens at the end of the 18th century, if I remember correctly,
Yes,
and then it's abolished already with a Meiji attack against Buddhism very quickly. And I mean, the fact that they so easily could get rid of it, compared with other Buddhist groups, of course, is another proof that this was very marginal.
Yes, and also I think you're right that they got institutionalized in 1792. I think this is from my head now.
Yeah, you probably have the numbers better in your head than I have at the moment.
Yeah, it's just that I have taken lots of notes, but of course we're doing it differently, so I can't use my notes for very much. But I find that interesting because we usually say it's much earlier, but I mean, we say that it's like at the end of the 17th century that the Fuke came into being. That's the usual story that we're told as shakuhachi players. And you write that there were much more, maybe a loose connection with Jodoshu or these kind of things during that time.
Yeah, I still go into the whole thing because I don't want to say something wrong. Where are we? I mean, these official documents which actually first speak of a Fuke, right?
Yes, and that's, you say, is quite late, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, the rules. I mean, we're talking about the rules, right? We are talking about the Takuhatsu, Shugyo Shintoku, and that kind of stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Which is towards the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century. Mm-hmm. So together with a more or less reconstructed date for the Kyotaku Denki, you will get a kind of time window where you can say, okay, now it's there as a sub-sect, as a ha of Rinzai Shu. And eventually gets his own temples. And now the question is, of course, how much you then would follow what is there in the Kyotaku, no? And to say then, okay, how much can we project back? And this is, of course, exactly what then people try to do. They are trying to find types of Komusō. In earlier periods. So therefore, all the reference to these flute-playing individuals that are there in the sources, and try to create a link between the Sung period transmission of this lineage from China to Japan and the relatively late institutionalization. So you see what you have to do. You have to leave the solid ground of historical sources and jump into the legend, and then it's the question how much of that you accept. Yes. And how you actually bring proof that let's say the Komusō, not the Komusō, but the Komusō, the Boroboros are actually prototypes to what degree of the Komusōs. Mm. And that's, of course, that's a tricky thing. I mean, because we are then we are saying, okay, because they're playing the flute as well, so they must have been something like the Komusō. Right. But of course, it's a projection backwards that a strict historian is not very comfortable to do.
Okay, so there's no evidence of that lineage. As we learn first the Boros and then the Komusō and then the Komusō.
Because of course what you would like is a kind of densening bundle of features, right, that come from somewhere and then become what we know as the Komusō.
Absolutely.
So the mendicant monk, kind of monk, with the beehive and the flute and the kesa and everything. And of course, these elements are not there in a lot of cases in these early so-called prototypes. So as far as much as I can accept an urge to kind of push it back, historically we are trapped with what we have.
Yes.
And for that we can only say probably, let's say, second half of the 18th century, that it was institutionalized in some way, that they tried to actually bring all these tramps together and make them into a proper group that can be controlled and surveyed, because that's of course what the Tokugawa system did. I mean, the temples were there to control. They were the registers for the population.
Yes.
So you would not accept people who were not registered. And what do you do with these guys who are running around doing all kind of silly things? You get them to be proper, institutionalized, whatever, monks in that case.
Yeah, and you wrote that Ichigetsuji and Reihoji, I mean, there are documents that are left of their institutionalization and some communication back and forth between the Bakufu or the office of temples and shrines back in Edo. But that is from the 19th century.
And then, of course, what you have is, which probably is just a kind of, I would read it as a kind of prolongation, a continuation from an earlier kind of shakuhachi practice before they were institutionalized, where actually lay people would also pick up the bamboo and start playing just because they liked it, just because they were interested. And that again then dovetails with another tendency towards the late Tokugawa period, where actually the merchants, of course, try to become, as I write in the article, culturally and politically more influential. So they're actually claiming what they really are in society. So the buke, the samurais, of course, well, a lot of them are just, they're lucky they can become Komusō and
so the class structure at that time really changed, you can say.
Exactly. And then it quite clearly becomes a part of that emerging cultural sphere, which then, of course, after Meiji restoration becomes, I would say, functionalized for creating a national identity.
Yes.
So anything that's helpful then, without what is not helpful, is used. So if somebody actually then has this tradition of playing the bamboo flute as something typical Japanese, but still thinks he's a monk, okay, you can go on and play the shakuhachi and cultivate it in the right way, but you're not allowed to be a monk anymore.
Yes. There's no doubt
about that is what happens in the Meiji period, not only with the Komusō, but with a lot of cultural activities. They get channeled in a way.
Okay, can you give an example just to?
I mean, all these they start a little bit earlier. I mean, that's happening in that bourgeoisization of the late Tokugawa, where politically it's still not turned upside down, but there are already the niches where you can kind of act independently. Then is, for instance, the arts, right? Music, painting, this and that. And this is what then swaps over into the Meiji period, but is then, as I said, again institutionalized, because then of course you have the establishment of the Iemoto system, where it's clear what you can't run around and play the flute if you're not belonging to a ryu, right? you have to do it in a proper way in an institutionalized setting.
Yes. Okay. So let me just ask you about the Fuke temples that were scattered around Japan. I mean, what's his name?
Oh, you probably know much more about this than I do, certainly.
Nagatsuke, he counted like 77 temples, Fuke temples. But how do they connect into a institution that was recognized not before the late 18th century?
Yeah, see, this is something I know almost nothing about. So I haven't done any research on these temples. So I probably would have asked you questions and then draw my conclusions. So the question is, when are these temples attested? When are they called Fuke temples? What is their original lineage, if there was one? So it's a very complex in late Tokugawa, and then again in Meiji period, later Meiji, well, when Buddhism kind of gets some kind of power again. It's a very complex thing because of that complex system which the Tokugawa shogunate actually produced on top of Buddhism. So how you may have a temple it's called Fukeshu, but what was it before? Was it there before? And if it was, what was it? And what does it mean if it's called Fukeshu? Is it just an entry in a register, or were they how active were they, or were they actually was the temple the abbot, was it, or the kind of administrator?
We really need more research done on the temples, because apart from the Komusō, who were the wandering monks, there must have been, and we know there were abbots there. So what was their role? And were
exactly.
they Kiku, or were they something else? Or what was that?
So there would be actually an area where research could be done.
Definitely. This is big.
But I at that time had no access and had no knowledge of any solid work done on this temple structure.
I don't think there is very much. I mean, Nagatsuka mentions the temples, but as far as I know, he doesn't go close into it.
Yeah, and it may well be, and this would be actually an apology for him, that actually just there is not enough documentation.
No, he did a lot of very good research, and being an amateur researcher, of so yes, I think he lacked documents to use on. So you also write something about that, the way that, if I'm understanding you correctly, that the legitimization of Fukeshu and the creation of Kinkoryu is kind of connected.
Yes. Well, I mean, again, I would have to go to what I forgot, and I think this is the sub chapter about spiritualization and laicization, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wrote that
Yeah.
on page 29, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, again, there are certainly people out there who know much more about Kinkoryu and it's about Hisamatsu and
yes, that
Kurosawa.
might be true. But I was really struck when I read your article about this, that you think that the legitimization of Fuke Sect came basically around the same time.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not surprised. You only can be surprised when you actually have a certain kind of history in your mind, how this actually should have happened. If you don't have this kind of historical framework, if you just look at what you have in front of you as the scarce sources, then it's clear that there's an extremely there's a closeness, there's a proximity between the first kind of traces of the institutionalization Kinko-ryu and this period where the Fuke was still around. So, and then it's not very much of you don't need a lot of fantasy actually in that setting to see how it happens. That actually we know that a lot of late Tokugawa period, a lot of bourgeois, rich or fairly well-off people actually were getting interested in all kind of different cultural and arts activities. Then it's not very far to conclude, well, there's a certain overlap, and I could turn it around and say the Komusō never had the chance actually to establish themselves well enough before the laicization and the institutionalization of the Ryu actually happened.
Okay, that's very interesting. You know, I'm an ethnomusicologist, but I'm not an historical ethnomusicologist. I could have been that. You know, I'm the type of ethnomusicologist that get really excited about just knowing, researching into how people use music. You know,
yeah.
So it's certainly not my strong side, and that's why it's so great to read your article and also talk with you. So,
but I'm convinced, Kiku. I mean, if you look at if you look at how music functions nowadays, and even in let's say decades back, there is a continuity. I mean, using music on the receiving end, but also on the producing end, can be a powerful instrument of showing identity, and that's exactly the thing that happened with the Shakuhachi. Let's call it movement.
Yeah. Very strongly after the Meiji period, but also when we move into Taisho Showa, it really becomes a very strong identity factor.
Yeah, but what I would claim is that, I mean, that would need much more research. Is that these people in the Taisho and the Showa period actually were probably more interested in the aesthetic aspect of the music and the instrument, than, except for some freaks who kind of still knew about this, and who then went to certain places, put on the strange thing and played it in that style. But I think what the other interesting part is that there is a kind of re-spiritualization which kind of comes from the reception of Zen in a specific way in the West.
Yes.
And that is also something that is not restricted to this phenomenon. You find it in a lot of other areas as well, and not only in Japan, also in other places. I mean, it's an ongoing thing. Now look at what happens to Buddhism in China. Now that they have more freedom, at least in that direction. I mean, I go to China and they tell me a lot of stories, and I say, yeah, where did you get that from? 10 years ago, I didn't hear about that. And by the way, that story is very interesting because it's a constructed story as well. So I wouldn't tell them, but...
No, I understand. I mean...
Or I would put it into a slightly nicely packed.
China is, by the way, probably the fastest growing shakuhachi area now in the world. I mean, 10 years ago, I wouldn't even have thought any Chinese would pick up the shakuhachi. So it's very interesting.
Well, I mean, it has its Chinese roots.
Yes, indeed, and that's very important. Yeah. So,
although I had at one point I was given a Chinese chiba, and the fingering was completely different. I mean, the holes are slightly different. There's another hole which I didn't know what to do with, and so, but it's clear that it's the same kind of basic concept of a
yes, and same mouth
longitudinal flute. Yeah.
So just to try to summarize this, it's so rich in some ways. So I've just tried to write down, the big surprises for us shakuhachi players. I mean, first of all, as we already talked about, Fuke was not an important figure in Zen Buddhist literature. And
which freed him up for that purpose.
Yes, and that makes sense. Okay, the connection between the Komusō and the Rinzai Zen was established in the late 18th century. Late 18th century. Okay, that's a big surprise too.
Yeah, I have to say I was quite surprised when I wrote this. I actually didn't even want to publish it. It was an experimental thing, and then a friend of mine who had just published in that same journal another article of mine said, "Do you have something else?" And I think it was in Kyoto when it was the editor of the journal at that time, a German friend. I said, "Well, I would like to have something else from you." I said, "Well, I have." Probably we had already a little bit too much sake, so I said, I still have this thing about about this bamboo playing. So, oh, that's interesting. Just do something with it. I said, really? Okay. And then it ended up in that journal, and at some point I was quite surprised when I saw that this really had been received in the shakuhachi playing circles.
Definitely. What? I would say your article is probably the most important English language article on Fuke Sect. So
I hope it will not stay that. I mean, I hope that someone else will pick up the and shovel and dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I mean, there's a person like Gunnar Linder. He says hi, by the way, and Torsten Olafsen here in Denmark is also doing so. So there are people working on it, but still, I'm glad your friend and you had too much sake and you were convinced.
I think we had too much sake. Yes.
I'm sure you had. It's nice. Okay, so Fukeshu, if I understand it correctly from your article, it's only mentioned first time in historical documents apart from Kyotaku Denki in the first half of the 19th century. Is that so? Fukeshu as such,
as a term. Yeah, as a term.
But
I'm about that. I'm not sure anymore. I mean, we will have to revisit then the regulations. That one regulation 1789. The rule, which of course doesn't say Fukeshu in the title. So you may be right. I mean, I don't remember exactly what I.
But anyway, it's late. So either it's very late.
It's late. Yeah, it's definitely late. I mean, the second regulation piece was from 1818. It was already linked to the Myoanji, so he would then actually already assume, without really now recalling what's in the text, that there is some idea about Fuke.
Yeah, but that's 1818.
That's the 19th century. Yeah,
that's for us.
Which gives you the framework, as I said before. It's exactly a very short period of time.
So I wrote that the canonized musical tradition and the elements legitimizing Fukeshu in the Kyotaku Denki probably originated in the proto-organization of Kinko-ryu. Yeah, that started at the end of the 18th century. Yeah, so that's what we talked about, that they kind of went together, which is very different from what we are normally told. So also that the recognition of the Komusō, let's just even say that, from the Tokugawa Bakufu actually came later. It wasn't like in the early 17th century.
Yeah, I mean, again, I would say it lies in the nature of that control system, that they were you tame a group, but you're still not happy if they are not completely tamed, if they are still kind of wandering around uncontrolled. That is something the Bakufu was getting even more and more nervous into the 19th century, because of course the control was crumbling. There was resistance already, politically speaking.
Yes, and but on the other hand, in the legend we are told is that the Komusō were the only people who had the rights to cross any border.
Yeah, they obviously were still having some special rights. And of course, you have to be careful about this as well. I mean, this is what you find in the regulations, and the regulations are normative. What then really was done in practice is a completely different matter, of course.
Yes. I, my mother's Japanese, and there's part of her ancestry where they actually have a big collection of these kind of pass points on the roads where they wrote down who passed by, and the librarian there told me that, oh yeah, the Komusō passes by a few times, and I'm very interested in trying to go and look, what was written down about that. So that the fact that Myohanji was not a significant temple during the Edo period, that is also quite new, because nowadays it's so...
again a very natural phenomenon. If you're looking at something from the inside, you think that you are the center, that this is the most important thing. Mm-hmm. But if you look, and this of course where kind of I had the advantage of being zoomed out and having a kind of more broader, let's say, knowledge, restricted, but still a knowledge about what was going on late Tokugawa period and what happened early Meiji. So from an inner perspective, of course, you see things in a certain way, but if you look at in the broader context, again, even this kind of view becomes normal. It's not a special one.
Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
You look at, for instance, the third Zen branch, which arrived very late in the 17th century in Japan from China. Of course, they think that they are the most orthodox because they come from the land of origin, from China. But of course, they only have a couple of temples. Manpukuji, of course, is a nice temple, but it's not Obakushu is not very big. Okay. But if you speak to them, and I've been to Obakuji, they think they are the navel of the world.
Of course. And we Shakuhachi players do that too. So there's also the concept of secularization in Japan kind of made the need of, should I say, spirituality bigger or stronger, or is that right understood? Is it more?
Yeah, you can read it. You can read it as that, and it's more an interpretative tool than actually a tested tool in that context. So my claim is that when you get restricted at whatever you do, you're trying to find other holes and niches to do certain things. So it's a kind of equilibrium. So you could do something before, but now you are asked to do it in a specific way. So you're finding for ways to do it slightly different. in the framework that is given to you, and that's probably what you could call an aestheticization or a re-spiritualization of something, until, of course, then at the end of World War II, when it becomes more open, well, you can do what you want, more or less.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And the guild system, Iemoto system are contested, and
yeah, they're still very strong in there, but
yeah, absolutely. Okay.
I mean, take me as an example. I think Kato Sensei would never had me allowed to do what he did, playing Honkyoku at a very early stage, let's say 40 years earlier.
No, yeah, I can imagine that. Yes, probably not. Probably not. Yeah.
So I remember the others at the old Oji-sans had to noodle their pieces over and over and over again. And he just would give me some Tozan Honkyoku that yeah, play it, just do it.
Excellent. Yes, I mean, and there's so much happening, obviously in the musical sphere and like that. But it would be good with a little bit more of historical research to back up this one. Anything else you would like to say to Shakuhachi people?
Actually, I said, I think, more than I thought I would be able to say, so. Which actually also shows that you're a very good host. You just let me go and actually redirected me. So it was a nice experience. And what I can say to the crowd out there is that I was very surprised that the article was received, and that it was received actually that well. I actually would have experienced rather something like a little shitstorm. So what are you doing, deconstructing? I said, no, not at all. I mean, it was overall, what I read at least on the forums was very positive and very encouraging. So in the end, I feel it probably was worth writing it.
Oh, I think it was. I on the behalf of the Shakuhachi community, I'll say thank you very much for writing this. And also,
no, it was fun when I was writing it. I wasn't quite sure if it would mean anything to anybody, but obviously it did mean much more to the community than it did for the more narrow academic community. But that's good.
Yeah,
that's exactly what you always wish as an academic, but very rarely achieve.
Which is true. Okay, so with this, I would like to say thank you very much for your time and for a very interesting conversation.